Okay, so naming and labelling of Geraniaceae plants. As we're talking about the naming of plants and creating labels for our plants, it seems to me to be a good opportunity to look at the history of how plants are named. And I discovered that the first documentation of a geranium was actually in the 1200s. So that's going back a fair while. Of course, people who had geraniums in their gardens and in the towns and villages would have had their own names for them. And the names were quite different from the way they are now, because they didn't have a system for naming, and they usually just had a description of the plant. And every nurseryman and every botanist probably had a different name. So when they got together, they had to look at plants and try to work out just what name it had. So many plants at the time were used for the treatment of various illnesses. So a botanist and a doctor were often the same person, and this was the case with people back to when they were first described in the 1200s. And that particular plant was Geranium robertianum. Now, some people know that as Herb Robert, and some people are still using it for various reasons. I understand that a sore throat or mouth ulcers, people will boil up the leaves and create themselves a sort of a tea and have that. They also had lots of other uses for the plant, and they're too many to list, but I just jotted down it was used to treat diarrhea, kidney and gallstones, sore throat, and lots of other complaints. But as I said before, it wasn't known by that name at the time. People would have all had their local names. So most geraniums that the Europeans knew up until the 1600s were true geraniums, not geraniums that most of the nurserymen call our zonal pelargoniums, because they were simply not known in Europe. They didn't come to Europe until around the 1600s, so they were just not known. And when they did come to Europe, they were called geraniums because they had a similar seed pod. So the geraniums in Europe were called crane's bills quite often, because of the little bill-shaped seed pod that they had. And then later on, other plants started to come to Europe from all the explorers that were busy going around the world, sailing around the world. We know that lots of the explorers always took a botanist with them, because plants were very valuable. They were often the source of all sorts of resources, so that people were keen to find out what have they got in other countries. When we discover a new country, we want to know what's there. So the plants that have the names that we know today were just known by common names, and there's a list of plants compiled in 1633 had a plant listed which had been imported to Europe, and it was named Geranium indicum noctu odoratum. So you can see that it was probably a good idea for somebody to work out a system of having a proper but shorter name for plants. Now, just looking at that name, geranium, because it had a similar seed pods to the geraniums that they knew. Indicum, because they thought it came from India. So there were many ships who, there was the East India Company in Britain, and ships were going backwards and forwards to India and the East Indies, where they were bringing home spices and all sorts of wonderful stuff. No wonder they were looking for plants all the time, because these were the marvellous things that they found and that were able to come. And of course they had the use of them, and lots of people made lots of money from them. So just Indicum, because it came from India, they thought, but India, the ships going to India and back to Britain called into South Africa on the way for water and other provisions. So it really was a South African plant. Noctu sounds a bit like night. Odoratum sounds a little bit like a perfume. So a night perfume, geranium. We know it now as pelargonium because it turned out to be a pelargonium, not a geranium, and it's Tristi. And it was the first pelargonium to be brought to Europe. So it has quite an interesting history, and we're pleased we don't have to use that name anymore. So in the 1700s, a botanist by the name of Carl Linnaeus, who lived in Sweden, proposed a new system for naming plants. He first studied botany and became a botany lecturer. His family were very poor, so he needed to do a fairly brief, quick course in botany, get himself a job as a botany lecturer at one of the universities, and then he really wanted to do medicine, because medicine was part of a botanist's life. They were using plants all the time to make medicines for all sorts of reasons, and there was always something new to discover, so that made them very interested. So the other thing about the language that Carl Linnaeus worked out, or the system that Carl Linnaeus worked out, was that it was in Latin. And we know when we look at the names of plants, the actual botanical names, so the names of the species, then they're often ending in us and all the Latin terms. The reason for using that was that Latin was a dead language, and it's not going to change. Have you thought about how much English changes? Go back to Shakespeare that some of us did at school. Quite different language from English these days. And what about in the time since we were at school and now, the language that our grandchildren in particular are using? There is so much new language that's used on their phones. So it was very wise of Linnaeus and other people, because Linnaeus was one of many people who were trying to work out a new system, and they really all put it together. But Linnaeus was probably the last person who said, look, this is how it's got to work. And he proposed the system of having a genus and a species name for each plant. And that's a little bit like our surnames and given names. Not quite, doesn't work quite out like that, but very much like that. So it was a really good system. In South Africa, the explorers found it was rich in botanical offerings. Many of these were named geraniums when they were taken to Europe. Linnaeus named two of these plants, Geranium zonale or zonale and Geranium inquinans. And these became the basic two plants for all of our zonal geraniums. People became, as these new plants started to come into Europe, people became so excited about the fact that they produced seeds. They could learn to cross different plants to look for different what am I trying to say? Characteristics. Thank you. So this was where this system of binomial classification was devised by Linnaeus. So now we had a classification of genera and species, and he added a similar classification of animals to this as well. So if you're interested in animals, you'll find that their proper names, their zoological names, are similar to our botanical names. So these plants, zonale and inquinans, eventually were found to be a different genera in the Geraniaceae family. So Geraniaceae is actually a broader category where it's the family of geraniums, pelargoniums, erodiums, and a few other things that we don't grow very much. I think there are 6 of them altogether. It was noticed that they had different shaped flowers than the geraniums that they already knew in Europe. So they were named pelargonium using the Greek word pelargos and meaning stalk. This time comparing the seed capsule to a stalk's bill, whereas previously the geraniums were named crane's bills. The flower difference was very significant, as the geranium flowers have 5 equal petals in a single flower. So many people grow geraniums, true geraniums, the little, yes. I don't think they like our heat much. They grow them so beautifully in the UK, but it's difficult here. Yeah, I think some people can grow them if they've got a nice cool spot. Oh, right, yes, I've seen yours. Yeah, they're lovely. Yes. Pelargoniums don't have 5 equal petals. They have 2 large petals at the top and 3 smaller petals underneath. So they are unequal, although if you divided it down the middle, you would have 2 equal halves. It's a nice fan, but I have to keep hold of my paperwork. After much enthusiastic breeding of these new plants, new hybrids with semi-double and double flowers made it more difficult to ID a plant by its flowers. However, most true geraniums are single-flowered with 5 even petals, so they are easy to identify. They also have much softer leaves, and the leaves are much divided. However, the common name of geranium just would not go away. People went on using geranium for the new plants that came from South Africa, and there were the zonals and the ivies and many species. The zonals in particular, the name geranium stuck to them, and we still know that you can buy them just about anywhere labelled geranium when we know they're zonal pelargoniums. As a specialist society for growing and promoting pelargoniums and geraniums, it's important for our members to learn and use the correct name for plants that we grow. Please label your cuttings carefully, and if doubtful, do check with other members about the correct name for your plant. We have lots of experienced members who are very happy to help you find a name for your plant if you haven't got one, or if you think maybe it's not the correct name. and we have a great library of books for you to browse through and find your special plant. Just finally, when writing your labels, please begin the lettering at the flat end of the label. Otherwise, you will have the name tucked into the potting mix and it will be very dirty and you won't be able to read the name without taking it away and washing it. Okay, well done.